Hi everyone, it's Natalie here again with another video for Neat and Tangled. I am going to show you today how I've created this stained glass effect for the front of a card. I'm calling it like my stained glass window because I really got the inspiration for this card from the Scalloped die, like cover plate die that Neat and Tangled have just released as part of their February release. When I saw it, it made me think, it made me think of mermaids and snakes and the sea and all of those ideas. But then it also made me think of like a stained glass window that you might see in a church. And so that was the idea behind this card. And then I was trying to figure out how I could actually make that happen, and this is what I've come up with, and I'm pretty happy with how that's come up. And so I'm going to show you how I created this today. It is easy enough, let me assure you, before we get into it. I've started with a black card, which I just make my own. I just buy the cardstock and then I cut it to whatever size I want and fold it in half. So this is just plain black cardstock. And then I've adhered a white panel on the inside as well. And you know, the idea behind that is to really make these colors bright and stand out, because this is a transparent image, and if I had it directly onto the black, it just doesn't have quite the same oomph. So white on the background so that you can see all those really bright colors. So the next thing I do is clearly I grab my die, and I've made this card so that this would fit on the front panel pretty much exactly, with a little bit of an edge around it. And just to keep it in place where I want it to be, as I run it through my die cutting machine, I'm just going to stick a little bit of washi tape on the edges. And I do use washi tape because it will sort of come off the card at the end, and you don't have to tear the paper. It removes fairly easily. And then of course run it through my die cutting machine, expecting those cracks and noises. Don't worry, that's quite normal. Any of you guys with this machine know that already. And look, I just run it through a couple of times because I want to make sure that I really do get a good crisp cut image into the front of my card. And as you can see, like, it's going to do two things. Clearly it's going to cut out the whole square, and let me show you. So just removing that tape carefully so that it doesn't tear the paper. So it, for a start, has cut out like the frame for the front of my card, and then of course it's cut out the panel as well. And now we'll just have to pop out all those pieces. I've got some handy tools to help me do that. So I've just popped out all of those pieces, and the next thing that I'm going to do is adhere this piece to a clear transparent plastic. Well, to be honest, what I've actually done here is to cut this from a piece of packaging. When you get lots of scrapbooking products, these come from some of the backing of my dies. I save those pieces of plastic because they're fairly strong, and I find these work the best rather than maybe those thinner plastic pieces that you can get. And so I normally just, cut out a scrap piece, and I've got a whole stash of these. And I use them when I'm creating shaker cards or any time where I need a bit of a transparent window. So I know that's, of course, incredibly difficult to see, but what I'm going to do is adhere this just to the front of this panel. You need, I think, a fairly good, stronger liquid glue for this, because it's so thin and delicate, all these pieces. You probably need something that's got a sort of a fine tip applicator, and so I use my glossy accents, but any, of course, sort of strong liquid glue would work well, because you're not going to get your tape runner around these edges. And I'm not going over everything, I'm just going over the main bits, and I'm going to adhere this right smack bang in the middle. Sorry, ignore my phone making beeping noises in the background. I'm going to adhere this in the middle of the piece of plastic so that there's a edge of plastic all around the black edge, and you'll see why that's important later on. Set that aside to dry, but of course for the purposes of this video I will just keep on moving on. Now what I'm going to do is now flip this over, so I'm going to work on the back of the plastic panel, so the front where I've adhered the cardstock, and turn that over and colour in on the back. Now what I am using are some alcohol ink markers. I've got these chameleon ones which have some fancy techniques that you can do with it, but for the purposes of this card I'm not going to worry about any of those techniques. I just simply want to colour the plastic panel, and I've gone for a very colourful rainbow effect on this card, and I'm going to do the same again because I love my colour. But clearly of course you could choose any sort of colour combination you wanted. Stick with some, you know, greens and blues for the ocean. That was another thought I had. You know, if you, and the other thing of course is you don't need to have the markers if you've got alcohol ink. You know, those bottles, those refills, you could experiment with doing that. And you could just put like a wash of colour over all of this rather than colouring in each of the lines. But today I definitely wanted to just recreate this card for you, this rainbow coloured scalloped stained glass window effect. And you don't have to get the colouring smooth and perfect, because ultimately you're probably not going to be able to, and you're going to get these streaks, and that will be okay, because from a distance you're not really going to be able to tell. Oops. Oh, can't get off. And so you can see that the reason why I've turned it over to the back is because it gives me just a little bit more freedom to be a little bit looser with my colouring, and not having to worry about getting it exactly in the lines or worried about getting it on my cardstock. So I clearly am trying to just keep it within each of those little sort of panels, but I can just be, you know, a little bit more, as I say, sort of looser. I'm not sitting down and making this take up all of my day. I'm so sorry, I really should put my phone on silent. Now I'm just going to go ahead and colour in the whole rest of this with these rainbow alcohol ink markers, and show you how awesome this is going to look at the end. So that is all of it coloured in, and when I turn it over you can see how awesome that really does look. It's only going to take sort of a second just to make sure it's dry, and of course this is the reason why we use the alcohol ink markers, because if you're just using plain water-based ink, then you know that colouring on plastic is not ever going to really like stay there. It's going to smudge off and smear off. So what I then need to do next is, you know, I said I've left a plastic edge all around the edge of this, but I do need to trim that down a little bit more, because what we're going to do is to adhere this now behind the cardstock, the front panel. So I only want to have enough of an edge that it's going to hide behind this thin edge that I've left here. So we are going to have to trim it down. but by leaving this edge on it, this is how it's going to adhere to the cardstock. So it doesn't need to be very thick, but enough that we can glue it on. So again, to stick it down, I'm going to use my glossy accents because of the same reason. Like when you're gluing things to plastic, you need a fairly strong liquid glue, just to make sure that it's going to stay there. So just putting that around the edge, and then this should now fit exactly back into this panel that we cut out. So just going to move it around just a smidgen. And of course I am always just a little bit paranoid that that will not stick in place. So what I also do is maybe run some tape around the edges on the back as well. So I've got some quite sort of thin double-sided tape that will just be enough to sneak onto this edge and this edge. But now I'm just going to sort of set this aside to make sure that it's dry. And because, you know, I think this card just like this is already just makes such a statement, I don't want to add too much more to it. So all I literally want to do is to add a sentiment. You can see that I've added a Happy Easter to this one, and the Happy Easter comes from, again, one of the new Neat and Tangled February release, what's it called, Cottontail Cuties set, the lovely Easter set. But for this card, I might just do something a little bit different, and using one of the older sets, the Succulent Journaling card set. It's got some really lovely sentiments down here as well, which are sort of, some of them are a little bit more faith-based, like Be Not Afraid and Trust in Him. And I think those things go kind of well with the idea of this being like a stained glass window, or, you know, that church type of look. So let's go with Sending Prayers. You all know how to stamp, so you don't need to worry about me doing this. I use StazOn ink, and just using a black ink on white cardstock, and this is just a scrap of paper that I've got, or a scrap of cardstock. Very simple, just like that, nothing fancy, and then I'll just cut that out. Of course, you could cut it in a banner shape, or, you know, little flag shape. We're going to just trim it down a little bit. Let's create a little bit more interest by cutting a little banner end in that one. And so that will stick down here, and I'll use some foam tape to adhere that so that it pops off a little bit. And then last but not least, because I tend to end up doing this on all of my cards, I can't help it, is to add a sprinkling of sequins at the end. And the sequin mix that has just been released with February one is this lovely peacock colours, which is, you know, full of greens and blues and aquas and gold. So it goes well because I've got all the blues and the greens and the golds down here in this part of the card. So putting a little sprinkling of those on there, I think just gives it a little bit more interest and dimension without really taking away from the color scheme or the impact of the card. Now I showed you in my last video how I do my sprinkling of sequins. Is exactly what you've just seen me do there, is to literally sprinkle them on and then glue them where they land, because there's nothing that's more random than actual random placement. So there we go. And that is it. So it is actually a reasonably quick and simple card to do. You know, just a little bit of fiddling around with that colouring, and as you can see I just need to wait a little bit more time for that to actually dry in place. But I think these create really such a high impact, and this scallop die, you know, has so many uses, and this is just one of them. But I hope I've inspired you today to maybe try something different. Thanks guys, and I'll see you again later.